the 1950s, the CIA launched one of the most disturbing experiments in American history. Their goal? To control the human mind. They secretly drugged citizens, conducted psychological torture, and destroyed countless lives. Decades later, when the truth began to emerge, thousands of documents mysteriously vanished. This was MKUltra, the secret government experiment they tried to erase. To understand how something like this could happen, you have to go back to the start of the Cold War, to a fear that, true or not, the CIA took completely seriously. During the Korean War, American prisoners held by Chinese and North Korean forces came home acting strange. Some publicly denounced the United States. Some refused to come home at all. A journalist coined a new word to describe what seemed to have happened to them: brainwashing. Nobody in Washington knew exactly what that meant, or how it worked, or whether it was even real in the way it was being described. What they did know was this: if the other side had figured out how to rewrite a man's mind and the United States hadn't, that was a gap too dangerous to leave open. CIA Director Allen Dulles became obsessed with closing it. The agency had already been quietly running smaller, narrower mind control research under earlier code names, Project Bluebird, then Project Artichoke, testing hypnosis, sleep deprivation, and chemical interrogation on a handful of subjects. Those programs were considered too limited, too cautious for what Dulles now believed the moment required. So on April 13th, 1953, he authorized something far broader, a program with almost no oversight, almost no ethical limits, and a name that would later become shorthand for one of the darkest chapters in American intelligence history, MKUltra. The man Dulles put in charge wasn't a spy, he was a chemist. His name was Sidney Gottlieb. Quiet, soft-spoken, born with a club foot and a stutter he worked his whole life to overcome, Gottlieb headed the CIA's technical services staff, the division responsible for poisons, disguises, and now mind control. Colleagues who worked with him described someone almost gentle in person. He folk danced. He kept goats on a farm outside Washington. He would go on to personally approve some of the cruelest experiments ever conducted on American and Canadian citizens. Some of the underlying theory Gottlieb's team drew on didn't come from nowhere. Interrogation research developed by doctors in Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany during the Second World War had quietly made its way into American hands, partly through scientists and specialists absorbed into U.S. programs after the war. The CIA wasn't starting from zero, it was picking up where the worst doctors of the last war had left off. Gottlieb's first real obsession was a drug most Americans had never heard of, LSD. In 1953, he arranged for the CIA to buy the world's entire available supply of it for $240,000. In today's money, more than $4 million. He didn't stop there. The agency later struck a deal with a major pharmaceutical company to manufacture as much more as it wanted. Gottlieb effectively controlled the global pipeline of one of the most powerful psychoactive substances on Earth, and almost nobody outside a tiny circle at Langley knew it. So what did he do with all of it? He gave it away, quietly, through fake charitable foundations with names like the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, organizations that existed for one purpose: to funnel CIA money and CIA drugs into hospitals, prisons, and universities without anyone there knowing where the funding actually came from. Researchers thought they were running independent studies. Many of them were unknowingly doing the CIA's work. Estimates from the surviving records suggest the program eventually touched more than 80 institutions across the United States and Canada, spread across roughly 150 separate sub-projects, each with its own code number, its own budget line, and almost no paper trail connecting it back to its source. And some of what happened inside those sub-projects went far beyond a research study. In San Francisco, on a quiet street called Chestnut, The CIA rented an apartment and turned it into something agents internally called a safe house. A former federal narcotics agent named George White was brought in to run it. He decorated the place himself. Flowered curtains, pictures of can-can dancers, a setup designed to look like nothing more than someone's bachelor pad. Behind a two-way mirror, CIA officers sat with notepads and recording equipment. Prostitutes hired by White would bring men back to the apartment, men who had no idea what they were walking into. Their drinks would be dosed with LSD without their knowledge. Then the agency would simply watch what happened, how they behaved, what they said. Whether the drug loosened their judgment enough to be useful in an interrogation room someday. The CIA gave this project a name almost too on the nose to believe: Operation Midnight Climax. It ran for years in San Francisco and in New York with no consent forms, no medical safeguards, no idea what it might do to the people involved over the following decades of their lives. But the most damning case of all wouldn't come from a safe house. It would come from inside the agency's own ranks. In November of 1953, 10 scientists and CIA officers gathered at a quiet retreat in the woods of western Maryland. Among them was a U.S. Army biochemist named Frank Olson, who worked at Fort Detrick on the country's biological weapons program. Partway through the trip, without telling him, without asking him, Sidney Gottlieb slipped LSD into Olson's after-dinner drink. Olson didn't know what had happened to him until roughly 20 minutes later, when Gottlieb finally told the group what they'd all just taken. In the days that followed, Olson grew anxious, disoriented, increasingly unwell. Worried colleagues sent him to New York, accompanied by a CIA-affiliated doctor who was supposed to be looking after him. On the night of November 28th, in a room on the 13th floor of the Statler Hotel, Frank Olson went through the closed window and fell to his death on the street below. The agent assigned to watch him claimed he'd been asleep in the other bed when it happened. For more than 20 years, Olson's family was told almost nothing, only that he died during an Army research mishap. They buried him not knowing what had really happened in that hotel room, not knowing the word MKUltra even existed. It wasn't until The Secret came out in the mid-1970s that President Gerald Ford personally apologized to the family in the Oval Office, and Congress quietly approved a financial settlement. That should have been the end of the story. It wasn't. In 1994, Olson's son had his father's body exhumed and re-examined by an independent forensic pathologist. What that pathologist found didn't look like a man who'd simply opened a window and jumped. The injuries were inconsistent with that account in ways that suggested Olson may have already been unconscious or incapacitated before he ever went through the glass. The pathologist's conclusion was blunt. This looked far more like a homicide than a suicide. No one has ever been charged. To this day, what actually happened in that hotel room remains officially unresolved. If Frank Olson's case shows what MKUltra could do to a single man over the course of one night, what happened next door in Canada shows what it could do to hundreds of people over the course of years. At McGill University's Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, a respected and internationally known psychiatrist named Donald Ewan Cameron believed he'd found a radical new treatment for schizophrenia. Cameron's theory was that you could depattern a damaged mind back to a blank, childlike state, erase it completely, and then carefully rebuild it from scratch into something healthier. Starting in the late 1950s, with covert funding funneled to him through the very same CIA front organization's bankrolling experiments elsewhere, Cameron began testing that theory on real people. Most of his patients had walked into the Allen Memorial Institute for ordinary, even minor reasons: anxiety, postpartum depression, trouble sleeping. Instead, some were placed into drug-induced comas lasting for weeks. They were given electroconvulsive shocks at intensities many times the normal therapeutic dose, sometimes 2 or 3 sessions a day. Then came what Cameron called psychic driving, recorded messages, looped over and over through headphones or speakers hidden inside the patient's own pillow, sometimes repeated hundreds of thousands of times while the patient lay sedated and unable to move. Roughly 80 patients underwent this so-called depatterning in full. The results were not a cure for anything. Patients emerged with permanent amnesia, unable to remember years of their own lives. Some had to be retaught how to walk, how to feed themselves, how to use a toilet. Marriages collapsed. Children grew up watching parents who never fully came back. None of it had been explained to a single one of them beforehand. None of them had consented to anything close to what actually happened inside that hospital. The CIA's role in funding it stayed completely hidden for more than 2 decades. It only became public in 1980, when a Canadian news program tracked down survivors willing to speak. Lawsuits followed in the 1980s and 90s with partial settlements that came without any formal admission of wrongdoing from either the CIA or the Canadian government. And the story still isn't finished. As recently as 2025, more than 60 years after Cameron's experiments began, survivors and their families were still pursuing a class action lawsuit through the Canadian courts, still searching for the accountability nobody ever gave them. Hospitals weren't the only place the agency reached. Prisons were easier. Prisoners couldn't easily refuse, and almost nobody outside was watching. At the federal narcotics farm in Lexington, Kentucky, inmates struggling with addiction were offered virtually unlimited doses of heroin and morphine in exchange for taking part in drug studies, a system that essentially used their addiction itself as the incentive. Elsewhere, the CIA worked directly through federal penitentiaries, telling inmates they were helping test a possible cure for schizophrenia, never mentioning the actual agency behind the research. It's worth pausing on one strange irony here. Some of the people who volunteered for these CIA-funded LSD studies at university hospitals, not in prisons, actually enjoyed the experience and went on to become cultural icons of the very counterculture the establishment would later fear. A young writer named Ken Kesey volunteered for one such study at a veterans hospital in Menlo Park, California, and the experience helped inspire the novel that became One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Without knowing it, Sidney Gottlieb had helped introduce LSD to the people who would turn it into a symbol of rebellion against everything the CIA stood for. But for every Ken Kesey who walked away from this program with a strange story to tell, there was someone else who walked away broken. And nowhere is that contrast sharper than in a federal prison in Atlanta. One of those inmates was a young convict serving time at the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary for armed robbery and hijacking in the 1950s. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he volunteered. Over the next year and a half, he was given LSD repeatedly, by some accounts as often as 3 times a week for over a year, while researchers asked him the same handful of unsettling questions again and again. Could you kill someone? Would you kill someone? That inmate's name was James Whitey Bulger. Decades later, after he'd become one of the most violent organized crime bosses in American history, Bulger would write letter after letter describing what those months had done to him. Hallucinations, nightmares, paranoia that never fully went away for the rest of his life. He came to believe those experiments had changed something in him permanently. We will never know for certain how much of what Bulger became started in that prison research wing. But the documents confirming the experiments happened, confirming exactly what drug he was given and how often, are real. They survived. Most records like them didn't, because by the early 1970s, the people who built MKUltra had a much bigger problem than ethics. They had Watergate. As congressional investigators started digging into the CIA's activities on American soil, the agency's leadership grew increasingly nervous about what a program like MKUltra would look like if it ever surfaced in public. In early 1973, days before CIA Director Richard Helms was forced out of his position, he and Sidney Gottlieb made a decision together: destroy it. All of it. When the head of the CIA's own records center hesitated at the order, Gottlieb reportedly drove to the facility himself to make sure it happened. 7 boxes of MKUltra files, research data, internal reports, 2 decades of paperwork documenting exactly what had been done and to whom, were pulled and destroyed. Whatever full accounting of MKUltra might once have existed, the men who ran it made absolutely sure it never would. For a moment it worked. The story simply disappeared. Then, in 1974, journalist Seymour Hersh published an investigation in the New York Times revealing that the CIA had been illegally spying on American citizens at home. A story that had nothing directly to do with MKUltra, but that cracked the door open just wide enough. Congress launched the Church Committee. The White House launched its own investigation, the Rockefeller Commission. Investigators went looking for the truth about the CIA's domestic activities and ran straight into a wall. Almost everything had already been shredded. The only substantial document they had to work with was a single surviving 1963 internal report, and it told them frustratingly little. It looked like Gottlieb had won, like the program really would stay erased. And then, in 1977, something almost accidental happened. A CIA employee, responding to a routine Freedom of Information Act request, kept digging instead of giving up, and found 7 boxes of material that had been misfiled years earlier, sent to a different records facility entirely, completely missed during the original 1973 purge. Inside those boxes, roughly 20,000 documents nobody at the agency ever intended the public to see. It wasn't the full story, it was a fragment, mostly financial records, budget lines, project numbers, with the actual research still maddeningly vague, but it was enough to force new Senate hearings later that year, led in part by Senator Edward Kennedy. Sidney Gottlieb himself was called to testify. His lawyer negotiated him immunity from prosecution in exchange for his cooperation, and even then, under oath, Gottlieb claimed he could remember almost nothing concrete about a program he had personally designed, funded, and run for the better part of 2 decades. No one, not Gottlieb, not Helms, not a single doctor or researcher involved in any sub-project, was ever criminally charged for what happened inside MKUltra. So what's actually left? More than 70 years after Alan Dulles signed that first authorization. 20,000 surviving pages, fragments at best, with whole stretches of the real human cost missing entirely because the men responsible made sure of it. We know roughly how much was spent. We have a rough map of which universities, which hospitals, which prisons took part. We have names like Frank Olson and Whitey Bulger and dozens of psychiatric patients in Montreal whose lives were never the same. But for every documented case, researchers who've spent decades on this believe there are others we will simply never identify, because the paperwork that would have named them no longer exists. Some of what MKUltra learned didn't vanish with the documents either. Several of the psychological pressure techniques studied during this era, sensory deprivation, disorientation, exploiting a subject's sense of helplessness, later turned up in a CIA interrogation manual from the 1960s known internally as HUBARC, declassified decades afterward. Researchers and journalists have since traced disturbing echoes between that manual's methods and interrogation practices that resurfaced in entirely different wars, under entirely different names, decades later. The technique survived. The accountability never did. In the end, the CIA built a program meant to prove that the human mind could be erased and rewritten by someone else's hand. They never actually managed to do that to anyone, not in the way they hoped. What they did manage to do was scatter the trauma of that failure across hundreds of unwitting people, and then try to erase the evidence of it instead. It almost worked. A misfiled box of expense reports is the only reason it didn't. If you found this one as unsettling as we did, subscribe for more declassified history the government never meant for the public to see. And let us know in the comments which secret program you want covered.